Pain visits every soul. It does not ask for permission, nor does it wait for readiness. It walks into the quiet of our days, into celebrations, into ordinary moments, and upends them without explanation. There is a moment, whether whispered in the middle of the night or cried into a pillow soaked with sorrow, when the heart asks, "Why me? Why now? Why this?" Suffering is one of the few things that makes every person equal. It does not bow to wealth, to intelligence, or to strength. The child who loses a parent, the woman waiting by a hospital bed, the man silently battling shame behind a smile, they all share a bond that cannot be explained, only felt. And within that pain, 1,000 questions are born. Where is God when it hurts? If he is truly loving, why would he allow this ache, this loneliness, this loss? These are not questions of rebellion, they are questions of relationship. They do not come from a hardened heart, but a breaking one. These are the questions of someone who once believed the world was safe, only to find it shattered underfoot. For some, the pain came like a storm, sudden and merciless. For others, it has been a long road, grief that never left, a wound that never healed, a silent suffering carried like a secret. And yet, in that very place where the soul aches most deeply, there is a faint stirring, a whisper that dares to ask, can this hurt mean something more? Is there a purpose hidden in what I do not understand? Even in the darkest of valleys, there is a truth that will not be silenced. Pain is not the end of the story. Though it may feel like a cruel interruption, though it may appear as the final word, it is not. What looks like ruin may be the beginning of something redemptive. What feels like abandonment may become the ground on which transformation begins. Tears have a voice. They speak the language of the heart when words are not enough, and each tear, though it falls unseen by others, is noticed. Not a single one is wasted. In Psalm 56, verse 8, it is written, "You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. They are not forgotten, they are remembered, gathered, and honored." The human heart longs to make sense of suffering. It looks for answers, for meaning, for anything that can bring peace to the ache. And sometimes in that longing, it finds not an answer, but a presence. Not an explanation, but a comfort. The path to healing does not begin with understanding. It begins with honesty. And in the place where honesty meets mystery, a different kind of story begins to unfold. It is not the kind of story that wraps everything in a neat ending or gives quick relief. It is the kind of story that changes a person from the inside, that invites them to see their life through a different lens, that reveals a strength they did not know they had, and a grace that holds them when nothing else does. This is the story that heals. When everything falls apart, when hope flickers and faith trembles, it is then that the soul becomes still enough to hear what cannot be heard in comfort. It is there that something eternal starts to form, not in spite of the pain, but through it. What if every wound is a doorway? What if every ache leads somewhere sacred? What if the pain that seems to tear us down is actually preparing us to carry something greater? The journey through pain is not easy. It is not quick, but it is not empty. And though it may feel like you walk alone, you do not. Others have walked it too, and from their steps, light still shines. As we begin this sacred exploration, let every question be welcomed. Let every sorrow be held with gentleness. Let every listener know that their pain is not strange, not shameful, and not forgotten. It is part of a much bigger story. A story that begins in the deepest ache but does not end there. This is not just about why pain exists. It is about how pain can be redeemed. It is about the beauty that can rise from ashes and the healing that can come even while the scars remain. It is about the quiet hope that refuses to die, even when everything else feels lost. In the vast narrative of human pain, few stories resonate with the raw, unfiltered reality of undeserved suffering like that of Job. His story begins not with wrongdoing, not with failure, but with righteousness. He was described as a man who was blameless and upright, someone who feared God and turned away from evil. His life was one of integrity, of devotion, and of peace. He had a family he loved, possessions he managed wisely, and a reputation that carried weight. To those who looked upon him, he seemed to be living proof that goodness was rewarded, that faithfulness led to favor. Yet in a single, unimaginable stretch of time, that picture shattered. Without warning, Job's world collapsed. His livestock, his wealth and sustenance were destroyed. His servants, his trusted helpers and companions, were killed. His children, his very heart, were taken in a moment. And as if the emotional and relational devastation were not enough, his body soon followed into affliction, struck with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. What had once been the image of stability now sat in the dust, scraping his wounds with broken pottery, silent under the weight of what had been lost. There was no gradual unraveling. There was no time to prepare. Job fell from fullness to ruin with breathtaking speed. What makes Job's story so piercing is not only the intensity of his suffering, but the stark absence of cause. He had not sinned to invite this disaster. He had not turned away from righteousness. The storm descended upon him, not because he was guilty, but because he was chosen. And herein lies the mystery that confronts the soul, the idea that pain can come not as punishment, but as a kind of proving ground. That righteousness does not insulate one from suffering, but may in fact make one a candidate for it. As Job sat in silence, his grief unspoken and unshared, even his closest relationships began to fracture. His wife, broken by her own sorrow, urged him to curse God and die. His friends, well-meaning but blind to the spiritual depth of his trial, came not with comfort, but with accusations. They reasoned that suffering must come from sin, and so they probed Job's heart, convinced he had hidden guilt. They tried to simplify what is complex, to explain away what cannot be explained, and in doing so, they added another layer to his affliction, the wound of being misunderstood. Yet Job refused to wear the garments of false guilt. He did not accept their reasoning. He lamented, he questioned, he cried out, but he remained honest. His dialogue with God was not polished or polite. It was raw, emotional, even confrontational. He poured out his confusion with boldness. He asked why he had been born, why his life was preserved only to suffer. In Job chapter 3 verse 11 he cried, "Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb?" These were not words of rebellion, but of a man who refused to pretend. He brought his sorrow to God, not away from him. He remained in the relationship even when it felt one-sided. The silence of God is perhaps the most haunting part of Job's journey. For many chapters there is no divine response, no comfort, no explanation, just the emptiness between heaven and earth, and the sound of Job's voice echoing in the void. This silence is not unfamiliar to those who suffer deeply. It is in these moments that faith is tested, not by opposition, but by absence. When the heavens seem closed and every prayer dissolves into air, it becomes clear whether faith was rooted in feelings or in something deeper. Eventually, when God does speak, it is not with an answer, but with a revelation. He does not explain the reason behind Job's suffering. Instead, he reveals the vastness of his wisdom. In Job chapter 38, verse 4, God asks, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" Tell me if you understand. This was not a dismissal of Job's pain, but a redirection of perspective. God showed him the immensity of creation, the intricacy of life, the orchestration of the universe beyond what any human can grasp. And in that, Job saw something greater than explanation. He saw the glory of a God who is sovereign, even when silent. What followed was not a theological conclusion, but a transformation of the soul. Job did not receive the full reason for his trial, but he encountered the one who held the reason. In that moment, the presence of God became enough. His questions were not all answered, but his heart found rest. He declared in Job chapter 42 verse 5, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." This is the turning point. The moment when suffering gives way to encounter, when the smoke of confusion lifts just enough for glory to shine through. Job's story teaches not that pain is logical, but that it is purposeful. It shows that faith is not proven in prosperity, but in pressure, that the deepest truths are not learned in comfort, but in chaos. Through his trial, Job was stripped of all that could be shaken, and what remained was what could not be taken: his integrity, his trust, and his longing for God. In the end, what Job gained was not merely restoration, but revelation. He was given back much of what had been lost, but more than that, he was given the sight to see the invisible hand that held him through it all. And for every soul who has felt the weight of unanswered pain, his story stands as a witness, not to the absence of justice, but to the presence of mystery. Not to the cruelty of fate, but to the shaping hand of a loving, eternal God who does not always explain, but who always redeems. Suffering, as Job knew it, did not invalidate his faith. It deepened it. It purified it. It drew him into a knowledge of God that no prosperity could ever produce. And even now, his voice echoes through time, calling each of us to wrestle, to weep, to remain, and to know that sometimes the fire does not destroy, it reveals. In the long arc of Scripture, the life of Joseph stands as a striking testimony to the unseen hand of divine orchestration. His journey unfolds not in a straight line, but through the winding corridors of betrayal, false accusation, and abandonment. He was the favored son, marked early by a dream that lifted his eyes above his station. Clothed in a coat of many colors, Joseph was destined for greatness, or so it seemed. But as with many divine callings, the path to that destiny did not come through ease, but through hardship that seemed at times to contradict every promise ever spoken over his life. Joseph's troubles began not with enemies, but with his own family. His brothers, consumed by jealousy and resentment, could not bear the thought of their younger brother being exalted above them. Their hatred took form not in words alone, but in action. They stripped him of his robe, the symbol of his father's affection, and threw him into a pit with no water. In that dry and desolate place, surrounded by silence and dirt, Joseph's dream must have begun to blur. What once filled his heart with hope was now buried under the weight of rejection and confusion. But it did not end in the pit. Betrayal deepened when his brothers sold him into slavery, allowing their own father to believe he was dead. Joseph was carried away to a foreign land, sold to strangers, and forced to begin again with nothing but his memories and questions. In Egypt, he served in the house of Potiphar, where his character shone despite his circumstances. He worked faithfully, and for a time it seemed as though things might improve. But just when light appeared on the horizon, darkness descended again. Potiphar's wife, driven by desire and wounded pride, falsely accused Joseph of a crime he did not commit. Without trial or defense, he was cast into prison. This was not the prison of regret or moral failure, it was the prison of injustice. He was condemned not for wrongdoing, but for righteousness. And there, in the quiet of a forgotten cell, Joseph faced not just the loss of freedom, but the ache of being misunderstood and unseen. It's in these long, silent seasons that many begin to wonder whether God is truly present. The prayers feel unanswered, the doors remain shut, and the dream seems further away than ever before. Yet Joseph's story reveals a truth often hidden from the surface, that God's silence is not the same as his absence. In the pit, in the palace, and in the prison, God was working, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. Each delay, each injustice, each forgotten promise was weaving something larger than Joseph could comprehend. Even in prison, Joseph continued to serve. He interpreted dreams for fellow inmates, hoping perhaps that his faithfulness would be remembered. But even then, he was forgotten once again. Another year passed, and then another. Yet in that unseen place, his heart was being prepared. His humility was being forged. His discernment sharpened. No moment was wasted, though every moment felt like waiting. And then, suddenly, the story turned. Pharaoh, tormented by dreams he could not understand, called for someone who could bring clarity. Joseph, the forgotten prisoner, was remembered. He was summoned not gradually, but instantly, brought from the darkness of a cell to the light of a throne room. With wisdom that had been cultivated in obscurity, he spoke, and his words opened the way to his destiny. Pharaoh saw what others could not see. He appointed Joseph as second in command, placing the weight of the nation upon the shoulders of the one who had been cast aside by his own brothers. What stands out in Joseph's journey is not just the reversal of fortune, but the posture of his heart. When finally reunited with those who had betrayed him, he did not seek revenge. He saw something greater. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he spoke words that echo through time. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This was not denial of the pain nor dismissal of the betrayal. It was the recognition that beneath the human story was a divine narrative unfolding. Joseph's life teaches that seasons of waiting are not empty. They are fertile ground for growth, refinement, and preparation. What appears to be stagnation is often transformation in disguise. Pain does not disqualify a person from purpose. In fact, it may be the very forge in which purpose is shaped. The prison that seemed to hold him back was actually positioning him for promotion. The pit that stripped him of dignity became the place from which humility was born. For those walking through betrayal, for those sitting in the shadows of injustice, Joseph's journey is a reminder that no experience is wasted in the hands of God. There is no suffering that escapes his notice, no injustice that will not be answered in time. His plans do not bend to the cruelty of others, but they do often move through it. What is meant for harm does not have the final word when God is involved. He writes in layers, building meaning from moments that feel senseless. And when the time comes, when the preparation has done its quiet work, he lifts the humble, not for glory or vengeance, but for service. Joseph rose not simply to fulfill his own dream, but to preserve the lives of many. His story did not end with justice, it extended into mercy. He did not only rise above his pain, he brought others with him. And in that, we find a truth both profound and healing, that the path of suffering can become the pathway of salvation, not just for the one who suffers, but for those who follow after. Among the many voices that echo through the pages of the New Testament, few speak with as much authority on the subject of suffering as the Apostle Paul. His life, once marked by the prestige of a rising Pharisee, was completely transformed by an encounter with the very Christ he once opposed. From the moment he said yes to that call, Paul entered a life not of comfort, but of continual hardship, a life where suffering was not an interruption, but a constant companion. Yet remarkably, he did not see pain as a contradiction of his mission, but as part of its very essence. Paul endured trials that would have broken most men. He was beaten with rods, stoned and left for dead, shipwrecked multiple times, imprisoned without cause, and hunted by enemies both within and without. In his own words from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he recounts the dangers he faced. From rivers, from robbers, from his own people and from the Gentiles. He went without food, without sleep, and without safety. His path was one of continual strain and sacrifice. Yet through all of this, Paul maintained a perspective that was radically different from what most would expect. He called these immense sufferings a light affliction, not because they were small, but because he measured them not against the moment, but against eternity. This shift in perspective is at the heart of Paul's endurance. He saw life not as an end in itself, but as a preparation for something greater. His eyes were fixed not on what was seen, but on what was unseen. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, he wrote, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." This was not denial of pain, but a deeper understanding of its role in the journey. Paul knew that every scar, every hardship, every unanswered question was forming within him a kind of strength that did not fade with time, but deepened. What made Paul's endurance extraordinary was not just what he suffered, but how he responded. He did not retreat into self-pity, nor did he distance himself from his calling. Instead, he leaned into the very places that wounded him the most. He returned to the cities where he had been attacked. He preached to those who rejected him. He wrote letters from prison not of despair, but of joy and encouragement. His sufferings became sermons. His chains became the backdrop for some of the most powerful declarations of freedom ever written. Paul's endurance was not rooted in sheer willpower or human strength. It was grounded in grace. In his most vulnerable moments, he did not hide his weakness. He revealed it. He spoke openly of the thorn in his flesh, that mysterious affliction which caused him deep distress. He pleaded for its removal, but received instead a word from God that would define his entire understanding of suffering. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." With those words, found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, Paul did not simply accept his weakness, he embraced it. This truth turned everything upside down. Weakness was no longer something to be ashamed of, but something to boast in. It was no longer the thing that disqualified a person, but the very thing that invited the strength of God to be displayed more clearly. Paul's life became a living paradox. The more he suffered, the more he spoke with authority. The more he was broken, the more he reflected divine power. The less he relied on himself, the more the Spirit of God moved through him. There is something deeply liberating in Paul's perspective. For those who suffer and feel disqualified by their pain, his life stands as a reminder that the presence of hardship does not cancel out the call of God. In fact, it may confirm it. Pain does not signal abandonment, but invitation, an invitation into deeper trust, deeper intimacy, and deeper usefulness. Paul's wounds did not sideline him, they opened doors. His endurance was not sterile perseverance, but vibrant participation in a mission that extended beyond himself. Paul also teaches that endurance is not just about surviving trials, but about transforming them into opportunities for love. He suffered not just for the sake of suffering, but for the sake of others. His letters reveal a heart that broke for the people he served. He wept for the churches. He prayed through the night. He bore not only physical burdens, but emotional ones. His endurance was an act of love. It was the outpouring of a life given not to comfort, but to calling. Even in his final days, when his body was worn and the shadow of death drew near, Paul's voice remained steady. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, he declared, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." This was not a cry of defeat, but a proclamation of victory, not because his life had been easy, but because it had been faithful. Paul's endurance stands as a blueprint for every soul who feels the weight of suffering. It shows that pain, when seen through the eyes of eternity, becomes not a curse but a tool. It refines, it humbles, it awakens. And in that awakening, the soul finds strength not of its own making, but of divine origin. The kind of strength that does not fade under pressure, but flourishes. The endurance of Paul invites us to believe that suffering is not meaningless. It calls us to embrace the hard places not as places of defeat, but as altars of transformation. It reminds us that when we are weak, we are never alone, and that through the cracks of our frailty, the light of heaven often shines the brightest. At the center of all human suffering stands a figure whose pain redefined what it means to suffer. Unlike the stories of Job, Joseph, or Paul, the suffering of Jesus was not the result of sin, nor the consequence of injustice directed at a flawed human being. His suffering was entirely undeserved, wholly unearned, and yet fully embraced. He was the only one who did not deserve to hurt, and yet he chose to enter the very heart of human agony, not only to understand it, but to redeem it. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the weight of what was to come pressed down upon him with a force that words failed to capture. It was not just the fear of death that gripped him, but the knowledge that he would bear the sin of the world, past, present, and future. The garden was not a place of serenity, but of deep, wrenching sorrow. There, beneath the olive trees, Jesus prayed with a sorrow that shook his entire being. The Gospel of Luke tells us that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. This was not symbolic pain. It was real, physical, spiritual agony. And yet, in the same breath, he yielded to a purpose beyond pain, uttering the words that would change history. "Not my will, but yours be done." What followed was not a brief moment of suffering, but a descent into every layer of human agony. Betrayed by one of his closest companions, handed over to those who sought to silence him, falsely accused and violently beaten, Jesus endured every form of humiliation imaginable. The crown of thorns pressed into his brow was not only an act of cruelty, it was a mockery of his kingship. The purple robe thrown over his shoulders was meant to degrade, not to honor. He was struck, spit upon, and scourged until his back was torn and bleeding. Every lash was a wound he could have avoided. Every blow was a moment he could have stopped. Yet he did not. As he carried the cross through the streets, weakened and bloodied, the path ahead was not just one of physical torment. It was a spiritual journey into the very depths of human brokenness. He was not merely walking to Golgotha. He was entering into every form of suffering ever known to humanity. When the nails pierced his hands and feet, when the wood of the cross received his weight, he was not just dying a criminal's death. He was stepping into the place of every sinner. He was becoming the bridge between a holy God and a wounded world. On the cross, he did not simply endure pain. He absorbed wrath. The silence that had echoed in Job's story now returned, but in a different form. Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words that resonate with anyone who has ever felt abandoned in the midst of suffering. But this time, the silence was not just a mystery, it was a transaction. He took upon himself the separation we deserved, so that we might be brought near. He entered into the absence of God so that we might live in his presence. The cross was not the end of hope, it was its beginning. What looked like defeat became the very door through which victory entered. Every wound he bore carried a purpose. As Isaiah chapter 53 verse 5 declares, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was the foundational truth of redemption. His suffering bought what we could never earn: forgiveness, restoration, peace. Jesus' passion did more than offer an example. It transformed the meaning of suffering itself. In him, pain is no longer just something to endure, but something that can participate in the redemptive story. The cross teaches that the worst moment in history, the killing of the sinless Son of God, became the turning point for all creation. If that moment can be turned into glory, then so can ours. If that suffering can bring salvation, then no suffering is beyond the reach of purpose. The Passion of Jesus reveals that God does not remain distant from our pain. He does not look on from afar, untouched and unmoved. He enters into it, he chooses it, he feels it, and in doing so, he sanctifies it. He makes it holy ground. He declares that no agony is unseen and no wound is wasted. He teaches that suffering is not the absence of love. It is sometimes the very proof of it. There is healing in his wounds, not symbolic comfort, but deep transformational healing. The kind that touches not just the body, but the soul. The kind that restores not only what has been lost, but what has been shattered. The kind that gives peace in the middle of pain, not just after it. His suffering did not eliminate ours, but it infused it with meaning. And because of him, the cross is not a symbol of defeat, but of unstoppable grace. To look upon the cross is to see a God who refused to stay safe, a God who chose scars so we could be made whole, a God who walked into the fire so we would never have to walk through it alone. This is the heart of redemption. This is the story that gives every other story its shape. And in this story, there is room for every tear, every question, and every broken heart. There comes a moment in every journey through suffering when the question shifts. No longer is it merely, why is this happening to me? But something deeper, something more searching. Could there be something in this that I cannot yet see? The human soul, when pressed by affliction, begins to search beyond the edges of comfort. And it is in that very place, the fire of trial, the heat of sorrow, the blaze of confusion, that a strange possibility begins to emerge. What if this fire is not here to destroy, but to reveal? In the lives of Job, Joseph, Paul, and Jesus, the pattern is unmistakable. Each was led through suffering, not because they were abandoned, but because they were being prepared. Their pain was not evidence of divine distance. It was the very place where deeper transformation began. Job, once known for his righteousness, encountered God in a way he never had before. Joseph, betrayed and forgotten, emerged with a wisdom and authority that could not have been formed any other way. Paul, pressed on every side, became a vessel of a strength that was not his own. And Jesus, through his passion, opened the very gates of redemption. None of them were left the same, and none of them were consumed. The fire of suffering is often feared because it strips away what is familiar. It removes the supports we did not realize we leaned on. It unearths the hidden fears, the unspoken doubts, and the layers of self that we had not yet confronted. But fire also has another function. It purifies, it refines, it reduces what is false so that what is true can remain. In Proverbs chapter 17, verse 3, it says, "The crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests hearts." What feels like a trial is often the process by which character is shaped, faith is deepened, and intimacy with God becomes real rather than theoretical. There are lessons that can only be learned in the fire. Compassion, for one, is rarely born in comfort. It grows in the soil of shared pain, in the understanding that comes from walking through the valley yourself. Those who have suffered know how to sit with the suffering. They do not rush to fix, nor do they offer shallow words. They know the value of presence. They have learned that sometimes the most sacred gift is simply to remain. Humility, too, is forged in the fire. When all pretense is burned away, when the mask of control melts in the face of helplessness, what remains is something honest. Pain has a way of revealing our limits, not to shame us, but to lead us into dependence. It teaches that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the willingness to walk forward even while trembling. In this way, suffering does not diminish us. It breaks the illusion that we are self-sufficient and invites us to draw from a strength beyond our own. Wisdom, like gold, is not found on the surface. It is mined through hardship, through questions that do not yield quick answers. It is found in wrestling, in seeking, in refusing to let go, even when clarity seems far away. The wise are not those who have avoided pain, but those who have allowed it to teach them. Their insight is not just intellectual, it is lived, tested, and earned through nights of sorrow and days of silence. Most profoundly, suffering creates a space for intimacy with God that few other experiences can offer. When the noise of life is drowned out by grief, when distractions are peeled away by trial, the soul becomes still enough to hear a different kind of voice. It is in the furnace, as told in the story of the three men in Daniel chapter 3, that another figure appears. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fire, bound and condemned. Yet inside the flames, they were not alone. A fourth man walked with them, one like a son of the gods. The fire did not consume them. It became the very place where they encountered the presence of God. This is not to romanticize pain, nor to suggest that suffering is always immediately meaningful. Many fires burn without clear explanation. Many wounds ache without tidy conclusions, but even when answers do not come, presence does. The assurance that God walks through the fire with us changes how the fire is experienced. It shifts the narrative from abandonment to companionship, from despair to sacred encounter. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that the fire is removed, but that it does not consume us, that in the very place where we expected to be undone, we find ourselves held together, that what was meant to break us becomes the place where we are remade. In Isaiah chapter 43 verse 2 it is written, "When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you." This is not a promise of ease, but of endurance. It is the declaration that God is not outside the furnace calling us out, but inside it, walking with us every step of the way. For many, this chapter of life, this fire, is not chosen. It comes uninvited. But even in that there is hope, because within the flames, something sacred is forming, something eternal. And while the heat may feel unbearable, the end result is something that will not be shaken. So perhaps pain is not punishment. Perhaps it is preparation for a weight of glory that cannot yet be seen. Perhaps the tears are watering seeds that will bloom in a season not yet arrived. And perhaps, just perhaps, the fire is not a place of loss, but of encounter. There is a kind of grief that settles not only in the mind, but in the bones. It is the ache that lingers after loss has passed through a person's life like a storm, leaving behind debris where dreams once stood. In those moments, when what once was has been torn away and what will be remains hidden, it can feel as though nothing good could possibly emerge from the ruin. And yet, it is precisely into that space that one of the most powerful truths of Scripture speaks. Not only that healing is possible, but that restoration is promised. Isaiah chapter 61 carries within it the voice of that promise. It speaks not only of comfort for the brokenhearted, but of beauty for ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise in place of a spirit of despair. These are not poetic fantasies meant to soothe temporarily. They are declarations of divine intent. They are grounded in the very nature of God, who does not merely observe brokenness, but enters into it with the express purpose of redemption. His desire is not only to bring relief, but to rebuild, not merely to soothe the pain, but to transform the place where pain once reigned. In Job's story, the restoration was not symbolic, it was tangible. After enduring the loss of his wealth, his health, and his children, Job reached a point where he no longer sought restoration for its own sake. His encounter with God reoriented his entire being, and it was after that encounter, not before, that his life was restored. According to Job chapter 42 verse 10, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. But the restoration did not erase what was lost. It added to it. Job was not given a replica of the past, but a new future that bore the fingerprints of divine mercy. The scars remained, but so did the glory. Joseph's restoration came in the form of promotion, but it was more than a personal reward. His journey, filled with betrayal and abandonment, culminated in a position of authority that enabled him to save nations from famine. What he received was not only vindication, but the ability to extend life to others. His promotion was not self-serving, it was purpose-driven. When he finally faced his brothers, those who had set his suffering into motion, he did not respond with vengeance. He recognized the thread of redemption woven through the chaos. In Genesis chapter 45, verse 7, he told them, "God sent me ahead of you, to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." This is what restoration looks like when it comes from the hand of God. It is not merely the return of what was lost, but the birth of something greater. The resurrection of Jesus stands as the ultimate expression of this divine pattern. The cross, with all its horror and humiliation, was not the end. It was the turning point. Death, which had reigned over humanity like an unchallenged tyrant, was defeated not through avoidance, but through direct confrontation. Jesus did not escape death, he overcame it. The tomb that once sealed him in became the very place where hope broke out. The resurrection was not the undoing of the cross, it was its fulfillment. What was lost in Eden began to be restored at Calvary, and from that empty grave, the restoration of all things began to unfold. This theme of restoration is not confined to ancient stories, it is alive in the present. God continues to meet people in the aftermath of their losses, not simply to comfort them, but to rebuild their lives from the ground up. He takes the ashes of what once was, the broken marriage, the lost child, the shattered reputation, the years that feel wasted, and he forms something new, not identical to the past, but redemptive in a way the past could not have offered. In Joel chapter 2, verse 25, God says, "I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten." These are not empty words. They are the echo of a heart that sees pain and responds not with pity but with power. True restoration is not a return to what was, but the arrival of what could only come through the loss. It is forged in fire, shaped in sorrow, and anointed with grace. It does not deny the depth of pain, nor does it pretend that nothing was lost. Instead, it honors the pain by bringing forth a beauty that could never have been imagined in the beginning. The God who restores does not erase the story, he rewrites it. The broken chapters are not discarded, but transformed into testimonies. For many, the process of restoration does not come quickly. It unfolds slowly, sometimes invisibly, as new life begins to grow in the soil of mourning. It may begin with the smallest of signs, a renewed sense of peace, a fresh relationship, a door that opens when all seemed shut. These are not coincidences. They are the first fruits of a harvest long in the making. And while the full restoration may not look like what one hoped for, it will always carry within it the evidence of divine goodness. God is not simply the healer of wounds, he is the restorer of stories. He reclaims what has been stolen, he rebuilds what has been torn down. He breathes new life into dry bones, and he calls forth gardens from ashes. His restoration is not limited by time, nor is it dependent on perfect circumstances. It moves in its own rhythm, often hidden but always sure. When all seems lost, when the weight of sorrow feels unmovable, the promise remains. Restoration is coming. It may not come in the form expected, but it will come in the form most needed. And when it does, it will speak not only to the loss, but to the faithfulness of the one who never stopped holding the pieces. At certain points along the journey, the line between who you are and what you have endured begins to blur. Pain, especially when it lingers, has a way of redrawing identity, not with truth, but with shadows. What once felt like a life filled with unfolding purpose can begin to feel like a closed book, its pages sealed by disappointment, its chapters too stained by loss to continue. Pain has a way of convincing people that they are the only ones walking through it. It isolates not only physically, but emotionally. It whispers lies that no one else could possibly understand, that no one would stay if they truly knew the depth of the sorrow. But these whispers are not the voice of truth. They are the echo of a world that values strength over struggle, appearance over honesty. Yet in the eyes of God, vulnerability is not weakness. It is a doorway. Throughout Scripture, the valley is not just a metaphor for hardship. It is a setting where encounters happen. In Psalm 23, verse 4, the writer declares, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." These are not words born from theory. They come from a place of lived experience. The valley is not denied, but neither is it a place of abandonment. God's presence is not diminished in the valley. It is magnified. In the heights of celebration, he is worshipped, but in the depths of despair, he is discovered. The truth that often goes unnoticed is that God does some of his most profound work in the valleys. While mountaintops inspire, it is the valleys that shape. And in that shaping, he does not stand at a distance. He walks beside. He sits with those who mourn. He listens to the cries that never reach human ears. There is no darkness so deep that it can shut him out, no loneliness so complete that his presence cannot pierce through. The valley is not a place he avoids, it is a place he chooses to enter, but he does more than enter, he provides. One of the ways he makes his presence known is through the people he sends. Community, though imperfect and at times clumsy, is a gift that often arrives in the valley disguised as conversation, as shared silence, as an unexpected hand reaching out. There is something holy in the presence of another who chooses to stay when it would be easier to walk away. And though it may not erase the pain, it softens its edges. It reminds the sufferer that they do not carry their burden alone. Often the most powerful words are not explanations, but simple assurances. I am here. You are not alone. These words, spoken or unspoken, reflect the heart of God himself. They are the embodiment of Emmanuel, God with us. And when they come through the life of another, they bring warmth to cold places and light to dim corners. This is how healing begins, not always through solutions, but through presence. For those who feel like they must hold themselves together, who believe they must always appear strong or unshaken, this chapter offers a gentle invitation. Let yourself be seen. Let the tears fall, let the questions rise. There is no shame in needing others. There is no weakness in admitting that the valley has been long. On the contrary, this honesty becomes the soil where true connection can grow. It allows others to enter not as fixers, but as fellow travelers. The beauty of this truth is that no one is meant to walk alone. Whether it is the presence of God in the stillness or the presence of people in the everyday, the valley is not void of companionship. Even in the waiting, there can be comfort. Even in the uncertainty, there can be peace. The silence may still linger, but it no longer needs to echo with isolation. In time, the valley may become less of a prison and more of a place of revelation. It may turn into sacred ground, not because the pain was good, but because the presence found there was real. The one who walks beside is not in a hurry. He does not rush the process, nor does he grow tired of staying. His presence is constant, his patience is unmatched, and his love does not depend on the speed of healing. To every heart wandering in the valley, to every soul weary from the weight it carries, let this be the reminder: you are not alone, not now, not ever. You are seen, you are known, and you are loved, not despite your pain, but even within it. And though the path ahead may not yet be clear, you do not walk it in silence. There is a voice that still speaks, and there are hands, both divine and human, reaching to steady you as you go. What feels like an ending may not be an ending at all. The silence that follows a deep sorrow is not always the silence of finality. Sometimes it is the quiet pause between scenes, the stillness before a new beginning, the breath drawn in before a word that changes everything. The chapters that remain unwritten are not empty. They are waiting. And even when the pen seems to have fallen from your hand, there is one who continues to write, not on pages made of paper, but within the contours of your life. Throughout Scripture, the most significant moments often came after the point when everything appeared lost. For Abraham, it was after years of barrenness that a promised son was born. For Ruth, it was after the death of her husband that she walked into the lineage of kings. For Peter, it was after his denial that he became the rock on which the church would stand. Their stories did not end in failure, grief, or silence. They turned unexpectedly into something far greater than they could have imagined. What seemed like a conclusion was, in fact, a transformation. This is the nature of divine storytelling. It does not avoid brokenness, but moves through it. It does not skip over pain, but weaves it into the narrative until even the scars become sacred. Every story that has been redeemed started with a moment when it looked like nothing more could be salvaged. And that is where grace works most powerfully, not by erasing the past, but by giving it meaning that only time, faith, and divine mercy can uncover. You are not too far gone. Your mistakes have not disqualified you. The things you've lost are not the whole sum of your life. The ache in your chest does not mean the end of your purpose. Your story is still unfolding, even if the page you're on right now feels blank or filled with pain. The author has not stopped writing, and his plans do not crumble beneath the weight of suffering. They rise through it, carried by a love that is patient, deliberate, and stronger than despair. Even now, the story is being shaped. Even now, the thread continues, weaving through the moments that feel too ordinary to matter or too painful to endure. You do not have to see the entire arc to trust that it is leading somewhere. What was meant for harm, like Joseph once said, can still be turned for good. What has broken you does not have the power to bury you unless you let it. And what was once a place of mourning can become, in time, the ground of your greatest testimony. If you are still breathing, if there is still a flicker of longing within you, then let that be your sign. Your story isn't over. Not yet. Not now. Not with all that still waits to be revealed. There is more to come, more strength, more healing, more joy than you have yet seen. The pain has a place in the story, but it is not the final word. That belongs to hope. That belongs to redemption. That belongs to the one who never stops writing, even when you've given up trying to read the lines. If this message has spoken to your heart, if you found comfort, clarity, or hope through it, please consider supporting this space where stories of faith and healing continue to be shared. You can do that by subscribing to the channel, clicking the like button, and writing a comment below. Every response matters. It helps this message reach others who may be sitting in silence, wondering if their story still matters. And if you know someone who is walking through a valley, someone who needs to hear that it's not too late, that they're not alone, that restoration is possible, please share this video with them. Sometimes a single message can carry light into the darkest room. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for staying until the very end. May your story continue in grace, and may you always remember, it is not over yet.